Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If this happens to be your first time here, welcome to you. If you're returning, glad to be with you again. Thanks to whoever you are for choosing to place your attention here. I really appreciate that. Just now, before I hit the record button, I was sitting here reflecting on time and how I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking about the day and what other things I need to do, and I'm tracking time since I woke up, right? But then there are other times where time disappears, like it kind of evaporates, you know? In retrospect, I'm trying to figure out where the last 3 months went. I couldn't tell you. It's already the end of August. Summer's over. And tomorrow is the first day of school for my 2 daughters. And for anyone who's been around or was listening at the end of the last school year and all the trouble that we were going through, then you might understand how big of a hurdle tomorrow feels like for us. And we had a lot of encouraging signs over the last 2 weeks, especially this last week, that have us feeling hopeful. But it definitely feels like a hurdle, and there's maybe a few of you who've been around long enough to remember. I once told a story here on the show about when I was in 9th grade and I was on the track and field team, and I was never getting any points to get my letterman's jacket because I was always coming in 4th place. And then there was this one day where I was like well out in the front, and everybody was cheering me on because they wanted me to win this race. And there was just one more hurdle to clear, and I didn't clear it. I landed flat on my face in complete and utter disgrace. And I had to live with that. And it's like a deep thing in me, you know, that moment of just one more hurdle to clear and then not clearing it. And I know that tomorrow is not the last hurdle. There's a bunch of hurdles. They just continue to be there, but it feels like an important one. And some part of me, I guess, is just sitting here trying to prepare myself for the possibility that it doesn't go as well as we would hope. I'm feeling very melancholy in that space. But I do consider it my practice. Like tomorrow is it's a big day for me to see how I am able to show up in it, or in some way potentially be a force for good in it. I don't know how else to say it. But that is what I talk about today with my guest, Jeff Carreira. And this is a rare and auspicious conversation, y'all. It's one of these moments where I didn't have any say about how this one came about. It just, out of nowhere, I got an email from a PR person. I almost never pay attention to the emails from PR people. But this one was for this guy, Jeff Carreira, and he had a book, and the title is The Path of Spiritual Breakthrough, From Awakening to Cosmic Awareness. And I've just been thinking so much about this idea of intentioned focus awareness and the cosmos, and all of these words were in the title, and I read like a section, and it like was talking about exactly what was sort of going on with me in the moment when I got the email. You know, it was all these like synchronicities happen. So I just, without even thinking, just emailed back and said, okay, and sent the link, and he scheduled, and we recorded this while I was in Virginia. And it really does meet the moment for me in many ways, as I think you'll hear. I think that Jeff has a really accessible way of talking about things that are often impossible to talk about, things that I try to talk about on this show. I think he had a really clear way of pointing at it, and I appreciated that. So I was very grateful to have this moment to connect with him, and I'm glad to be able to share it with you today. Before we do that, I do want to take a quick moment to express gratitude for Podcast Premium subscribers, because it's through the support of people who choose to be part of that we are able to keep the show going as we do. That's how independent media like this survives. And today I specifically want to shout out Joseph Barnett and Nicole Fox. Thanks, Joseph and Nicole. We appreciate you. And if you're somebody who listens to the show and you feel like there's a value to you in it, and you want to have access to the full archives, or you just want to support it, the way to do that is become a Podcast Premium subscriber. It's choose your rate. You cancel at any time. And if you are in a tough financial situation right now and you wanted to listen to some old episodes, all you have to do is email us and we will send you a free account. But if you have even a little something to give, it makes a big difference. We're grateful to everyone who does that. To learn more about becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber or any of my other stuff, ongoing live stream classes, upcoming online teacher training, all of my stuff, everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right, y'all. There are maybe a few more things I could check in with you on, but let's save it for the other side, because I think that today's conversation is a good precursor to anything that I might share. So I will touch base with you on the other side. But for now, let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Jeff Carreira. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, Jeff. Nice to meet you. I'm Jay.
Hey, Jay. Nice to meet you too.
It's a pleasure to have this moment to speak with you. I am already recording, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to consider us having just begun.
Absolutely. I think that's fine.
Great. Well, I have to tell you that I feel like there's a lot of synchronicity that brings us together today. I would say this month marks 7 years that I've been doing this show. And in that time, I've received countless emails from PR people, asking me if I want to have guests on to promote new books that they have coming out. And I think that this is maybe the third time I've ever answered one of those emails.
Well, I feel completely honored, and also congratulations, by the way, on 7 years podcasting.
Thank you. It does feel like a bit of an accomplishment, and the 7 years feels like a cycle of sorts, like we've gotten somewhere with it. In any case, what I would say is what first grabbed me was simply the title of your book, The Path of Spiritual Breakthrough. But that wasn't what caught me as much as the subtitle, which was From Awakening to Cosmic Awareness. And just for you to have a little bit of background as to why that struck me and why the listeners of this show would maybe know why, is that I would say over the last year especially, I've really been wanting to inquire into areas of yoga and just, I think, philosophical viewpoint in general that challenge a lot of existing narratives around reality. And that's partly just because of my own personal experience and even just some more recent life crisis that I've been having to work through with my younger daughter who's having some trouble. And in all of this, what it came to me is my whole adult life kind of parallels the way yoga came into the mainstream. I got into yoga in the early 90s, and I had a yoga center for 10 years. And there's something that sort of happened in the mainstreaming of yoga where a lot of aspects of yoga practice got kind of put on the down low, I think. And that was because it made it more marketable, I think. And in certain ways, even myself as a teacher, there were aspects of my own experience and my own personal practice that I really didn't talk much about. Because if you did, it would make you seem very weird. And then there was a huge thing in the yoga world, as I'm sure you're aware, because it's happened in all kinds of spiritual communities, all spiritual communities, where the charismatic leaders fall from their pedestals because of scandal and abuse.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
so there's all these authorities in yoga that were there when I first got into it kind of aren't there anymore in the same way. And I think for myself, really, I've just become more honest and wanted to talk about my own personal experiences with understanding the consciousness-based reality that we're living in, I guess is the way to say it, which calls into question a lot of what we're sort of told is the case.
Right, absolutely.
So all of that is to say, you can hear maybe why it seemed to me like, oh my gosh, this guy's book, I don't know who this guy Jeff is. I was not aware of you at all before I got the email. But as I read through your book, because I did get a copy, so much of it was really deeply resonant. And it made a lot of sense for me that you're here today. So all that is to say, thank you for giving me your time and giving me this opportunity to pick your brain on what you wrote about, because I think it's really important and pressing for our times.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And, the parallel between you and I is very apparent to me already. Partly because in many ways, this book was a big step forward for me. I mean, I've written many books, but this was the first one in which I was as forthcoming about my own experience as I was. And for similar reasons in the past, I've tended to downplay certain aspects of my experience, especially in writing, and I really actually was slightly frightened about releasing this one because it's very personal.
And I'm curious about that fear, because I think I share it in all these conversations. There's always disclaimers around it and trying to find the right words to talk about certain things. I guess the fear is the fear that you'll be judged as less credible, because I think that's always been the case for me. I always didn't want people to think of me as some frou-frou yoga guy that I wanted to be thought of as legitimate or something.
Absolutely. I started writing fiction a few years ago so that I could write about some of my more sort of outrageous spiritual experiences in a form that I didn't have to kind of claim them. And this book was really one where I was willing to claim, but exactly what you said it's the fear that so many fears, people will think you are either making it up or are thinking too much of yourself or have kind of lost your mind a bit. There's so many different directions people can go with these experiences. So as you can probably tell reading the book, I really wanted to go through, and I don't want to make claims. I don't want to make outrageous claims about the nature of reality. I just really wanted to describe what I've experienced and the conclusions I've drawn from it, because that's what I think everybody's doing in their spiritual life. They're having experiences and then they're drawing conclusions based on those experiences, and the conclusions they draw have a huge effect on how their life unfolds.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think it kind of goes to where I thought we might start a little bit today, because you just said, people having a spiritual life. And I don't know that everybody thinks of their life as inherently spiritual.
Right.
And so, as you were saying, trying to talk about things that don't really lend themselves to words and challenge our conventional ideas of reality often involves trying to put ideas together in a way that are very accessible. And I thought that you did that well when you defined spiritual awakening, because for a lot of years, if you had said spiritual awakening or spiritual realization to me, I would have recoiled because of associations I have with like New Age, pie in the sky ideas about spiritual awakening or realization that were really tied into like concepts of transcendence. And you define spiritual awakening in a very graspable way, which just has to do with like understanding that there's more to the story than we're being told, as I was just saying.
Exactly. And if I think if most people think about it, especially, of course, people listening to your podcast are going to be spiritually awake by the definition that I use, which is at some point or another, they realize that the life that they're living, the world they live in, what they've been told about what's true and what's real and what's possible is not the limit. And they start to be curious about what might exist beyond what they know, what they've been told, what they currently think is possible. And they start exploring alternative ways of thinking, alternative practices, and they start discovering, the world is not limited to the conventional conception of the world. There's more going on here. And then you start to realize you don't know how much more is going on. And the more you look, the more you find out that there's even more than that, and even more than that. I think that's a very graspable way of understanding what it means to be spiritually awake and what it means to be on a spiritual path, which is simply that you're curious about, interested in, and pursuing more than what you already know. Right.
And then when you do that, very often stuff happens, like you have experiences, right? And sometimes those experiences go beyond our ability to even understand them or explain them to others. And that's why I think we look to kind of spiritual traditions and practices like yoga and meditation and other traditions where they concern themselves with these matters more.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely. And there's lots of spiritual traditions and spiritual philosophies that can be very helpful. One of the things that gets confusing to people is there's so many different traditions, so many different ways that people have described these higher matters, so many different paths, that it can be, people can wonder like, well, which one is real or which one is true?
And they don't all agree. They don't all agree on everything.
Exactly. They don't all agree, and they don't compare very well.
Yes. Sometimes it's apples and oranges. You're right.
No, exactly. Because the different paths are different, and they're looking at different aspects of the human experience. And most paths work best when they're not mixed and matched with others. I think the mixing and matching, the potential to mix and match, becomes more valuable later and not so valuable at the beginning.
It's true, but I guess that's where we are, at least in the yoga world. Everybody's mixing and matching, because there's a lot of, like I said, abuse and like cult behaviors that have been problematic in yoga circles and spiritual communities. And you have personal experience. You wrote about that in your book.
Yes.
Kind of being in spiritual communities.
Yeah, I lived in a spiritual community for 20 years. And it was, the most powerful and amazing and wonderful aspect of my life. And it ended in a big mess, kind of disgrace and inelegance, to say the least.
Well, you see, my point there is that a lot of folks, and I kind of consider this a positive, and it's always been the case for me because I never found like a guru. I wanted one, or never found a community that I felt called to go into in that way or to be part of. So it's always had to come from somewhere inside me.
Yes.
And it seems to me like in your book, when you're talking about your experiences, you are relating them, as you said earlier, to just what you can observe about your own experience.
Absolutely.
And there does seem to be certain universal things sometimes that run through all these different paths and traditions.
Yes.
And it was interesting to me because you talked about yours being kind of understanding or this realization that things might not be okay. And that was certainly the case for me. My mom died when I was 16. And that was like the big message. It's like, you know, things might not be okay. People fucking die. And I'm curious about that. Why a lot of people who are called to yoga or have a deep feeling towards it have had deep tragedies like that happen. And I'm wondering, why do you think that is? Why do you think that this realization that things are not going to be okay seems to be so connected to like spiritual awakening?
Well, you know, if we think about it in terms of, you know, a spiritual awakening means a certain paradigm has been broken, the paradigm of the familiar world. And that usually happens in one of two ways spiritually. One way is that you have some kind of revelation of more. You know, you have whatever, a vision of God or a massive spiritual experience. And that gives you some sense of, oh my God, you know, there is much more going on here. The other way that it happens, and, you know, I don't know, I haven't done the research, but I have a feeling this way may happen more often, is that things get so bad that almost out of desperation, you feel like there's got to be more. And, you know, we see that in stories like Eckhart Tolle's, you know, and Neil Donald Walsh and so many others, you know, who kind of hit a sort of existential rock bottom, and almost because they have no other choice, they just break into a new possibility.
Yeah. And that is really seeming to be the case for me and a lot of people I've met and spoken to, that it's almost out of a place of desperation where you kind of give up on other ideas that you had, like you said, a paradigm that you had or a way that you were seeing yourself, and you become surrendered in some way to open to some other idea than the one that you're holding, because the one that you're holding isn't working.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I guess then the next thing that I came to in your book had to do with the idea that just because you have a spiritual experience alone, like you can have spiritual experiences and they don't become integrated or part of it. Like it has more to do with, as you wrote, like the meaning we make of them.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so there's like a story we tell. And that's why I've been talking about this more, is because people have these experiences, but if we don't ever have an idea about the ideas we have around them change what they are or our understanding of them.
Yes, absolutely.
It seems to me that's what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Because, you know, it's a fascinating thing, you know, have been involved in spiritual, you know, I've been deeply involved in spiritual life for a long time. I was my own teacher's assistant. I've been the founder of a number of spiritual organizations. So I have had the opportunity to see many, many, many people and be aware of their spiritual life. And it was always fascinating to me that you can have two people who, if they describe the experience they had, like some big spiritual experience, they could have exactly the same experience, more or less, you know, from what you can tell. And yet for one of them, it becomes a life-defining moment that nothing ever, you know, they just become a different person. And for the other one, sometime later, it's just a memory of some weird thing that happened to them, but it didn't really have much effect on their life. And, you know, what I could see is that a spiritual experience, especially a big one, but it has the potential to transform you. But it can't necessarily do it on its own. How you engage with it and the meaning you make of it and the story that you come to believe about what it means is what will kind of complete the cycle and unleash the power of the experience. So if you conclude it was just a weird thing that happened to me, then it won't, that interpretation does not have much power. If you conclude that this was a vision of God, that interpretation will have a lot of power.
Right. And you write that in order to like have a new paradigm, you have to make room for things to be weirder.
That's right. I think that's important.
And those experiences, those weird experiences, they need some kind of interpretation, I guess is what we're saying a lot of times.
Yes. They do, because they're generally, they don't fit. So this book is called The Path of Spiritual Breakthrough. And the idea is that a breakthrough experience is by definition an experience that breaks through the edge of the world that you know. And therefore it can't be understood. When you have it, it's always something that's so novel, so weird, so strange that it doesn't relate to the laws of reality that you've known. And so you have to find a way to understand it. You have to find a way to interpret and make meaning out of it, because it's going to come as a bizarre occurrence.
I know. And I've been trying to find, like, I've had people coming on the show to talk about morphic resonance and energy fields and consciousness research and all kinds of ways of trying to find ways to talk about this stuff, because the words can be elusive.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, as we were saying earlier, from one point of view, mixing and matching different traditions and different ways of looking doesn't really work, because they often end up inconsistent with each other. At the same time, we all have to pick through and find those ideas and those interpretations that resonate with us. We're all creating our own resonant story. And I really encourage people to trust their inner intuitions because what else are you going to trust, really? In the end, you have to find something in you that is trustworthy, that when it resonates with something as real, that's a real one, and you can hold on to that one. And I think it's the development of our own spiritual intuition is, that's the core of discernment that we each need to establish for ourselves as we unfold on the path.
Yeah, I guess developing that ability to hear that inner knowing, because I talk about that all the time. I ask everybody to come on here, and I ask them specifically about intuition and what role it plays for them. And I have to admit, that's sort of been a big epiphanous thing for me. Is it's incredible to me how many people, even within the yoga world, hold what I guess would be very materialistic views. Right. Or more reductionist views, which is the predominant paradigm, right? Which is where consciousness is some just emergent phenomena, whatever that means.
That's right.
But matter is not imbued with spirit. So that's where I started, that reality is spiritual. The root of that is spirit. What does that even mean? I've been trying to talk about spirit, but because it means having to let go of this materialistic view that's really seemed to capture the minds of modern people.
That's right. I mean, we live, and I like to point out to people that, we live in a very materialistic culture, meaning that we believe that matter, physical matter, is primary and that mind is secondary. But that view has become dominant in the West over the last few hundred years. But before that, idealism was definitely the dominant view for thousands of years, which is that some form of mind, usually defined as God, some higher mind, is considered primary, and matter was created from that, is a secondary event. So, it may be that we finally got it right after thousands of years, but it may be that I just encourage people to question. I never want to tell people. So since you and I are on the same page here, Jay, I can feel this.
Go for it.
People, I once saw a famous spiritual teacher, someone who I've met numerous times. I really like him. And he was on a television program with a group of 3 other kind of authorities who were spiritually minded, but very materialistic atheist types. And this spiritual teacher that I know really was having a hard time in debate with them. And the reason was because whenever a person, let's call them someone who believes in spirit as primary, is in debate with someone who's more of a materialist, the parameters of the debate will always be that the materialist will demand that the spiritualist prove their point of view. Mm-hmm. And that is impossible, right? And you'll just get tongue-tied and you'll try and say things and they'll sound weird. But that's because you've already stepped into the argument. You've taken your first step in the argument by standing in the materialist point of view and then trying to explain yourself. I always tell people, if you get into an argument with a materialist, don't be goaded into trying to prove that mind is first or spirit is first. Demand that they prove that matter exists. And you can't do it. Mm-hmm. So the interesting thing about the dominant paradigm is it can have all kinds of unexplained holes at its very foundation. And because it's dominant, it can get away with it. Right. But any challenging paradigm it's demanded that it explain every minutia of it to satisfaction before it can even be considered. And I think it puts those of us who are not touting the dominant paradigm at a disadvantage often in conversation.
Yeah, you wrote about that too. You wrote about how we think of ourselves as living in reality, but it's really more accurate to say that we kind of live inside a definition, like that we have, yes, that we hold. That's what I was saying, bro, like the idea that we hold about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's what you're talking about. We're trying to challenge a set of assumptions about what's real.
Right.
Wow.
Yes. And this is very deep, this idea, because it can sound like, oh, we live in a set of assumptions means they're just ideas about reality, and those ideas change, But it's much deeper than that, because the ideas that are held culturally very deeply, they aren't just ideas that we believe in. They're ideas that shape how we perceive. And I use the example, if you imagine that you were outside and you see an alien in a tree, and it's far away, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can clearly see it's an alien. And then you start asking the people around you, and nobody else sees it. And maybe they do see it, but they're afraid to say, so they just keep saying they don't. How many people are going to say it's not there before you start thinking you're crazy? And how many more people will need to say it's not there before you'll start saying it's not there? And how long will you do that before you don't actually see it anymore? And this is how we get indoctrinated into a paradigm that then shapes how our perceptual filtering mechanisms work, so that we only see things that are in accordance with the dominant paradigm, and everything else we filter out. And that's why I believe many, many more people are having spiritual experiences than are aware of it, because I think 90% of the time, those strange occurrences of spiritual awakening just get filtered out of perception before we're even consciously aware of them.
I think that's so right. Years ago, I read about something, it was called the strangeness curve. And it was basically how if you have an experience that's so strange that you have no way to explain it to somebody, you won't know that you had it.
Yes, exactly.
If you don't have a container for a reference point for what happened, you won't even know that it's occurring, and that's taking place in a myriad of ways with us. And I guess, I don't know, that idea that we're talking about, this challenging of it, you referred to that at one point in your book about supporting the liberation of the human spirit. Mm. And I guess I had a question about that, because in this exploration of spirit, I've also explored a lot of animism and this idea of nature and connecting spirit, even listening to trees, I've been going there, Jeff. Mm-hmm. So when you say human spirit, I wonder is there something uniquely human in terms of spirit? And what do you mean when you say liberation of human spirit?
Well, I guess I in a bigger context, I would probably want to retract the word human and say it's just spirit.
Okay, fair enough. Duly noted.
Yes,
I pulled it out of context. In fairness,
in the context of the book, I think it's just because I was, the part of the context of the book is that I was speaking to human beings and wanting to liberate their spirit. Of course, it isn't really a human spirit; it's a cosmic spirit.
Yes, it's an idea about humanity, it seems to me, that's in spirit or with spirit or something.
Yeah. And we are, all of this is a manifestation of spirit. And that spirit it's not human. It's just the living, awakened, energetic life force that is shining forth in everything.
I think that's right. And I think you were also right when you said that there has been, and I don't know if this is my own projection because it's been my experience, but certainly in the people that I'm talking to are being attracted to me and have conversations with me, that a lot of folks are questioning the nature of reality in new ways and having all kinds of experiences around that.
Yes. And, I think in our world, we would talked earlier about how personally many people have a breakthrough when as I think you put it, just the way they're living isn't working. The way they're perceiving isn't working. And we're, of course, feeling that, I think, on a much larger level, certainly a cultural level, almost a global level, the way human beings, at least many of us, especially in the West, I suppose, but kind of generally, it's not working. And so that puts a lot of pressure on us, and a lot of people feel pressured to find something new. Now, what's interesting, if you think about it politically, almost everybody agrees that they want to find something new. But sometimes in political systems, you have progressives who want to find something new in one direction and conservatives who want to find something new by going back to something that was before that they feel will work. But kind of everybody's agreeing it's not working now. And I think, hopefully the pressure of things not working will eventually lead to a breakthrough of some kind. And it will probably be in a direction we can't imagine. If you look at great paradigm shifts of the past, they don't tend to happen in the direction anybody thought. They tend to happen in some tangential direction that nobody even knew was possible.
Until it happened, yes. Yeah, but it's interesting. I don't know. Sometimes like the political machinations seem to be operating on a frequency, and not that they're totally disconnected, but the kind of spiritual growth that we're pointing to in this conversation. I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes I think both of those sides, the progressives and the conservatives, they're both getting flamboozled by other powers that be in the political currents.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. There's a level of that sort of political engagement which is just so complex, and there are so many forces involved and so many ambitions and ideas and groups and corporations, and there's just so much at play. It's kind of a mess.
Yes, I know. And I think that's why many of us have been feeling like it's firmer territory in a way to be focused on our own inner experience in many ways. And
yes.
And I guess one point that you made in the book that I think becomes relevant at this point in this conversation, and you wrote it perfectly, you said, growth can't be forced.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that a lot of folks, when we start having some of these experiences, we become so impassioned by them, I think. We do end up, I certainly did for a long while, even after I knew I was doing it, it's hard not to grasp, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the part of the dominant culture is that we are indoctrinated into an idea that we are achievers and we achieve things. And that's how, and so when we first find spirituality, we relate to it as an achiever who wants to achieve something. And, you know, in the end, you begin to realize, oh, this is not something I can achieve. I can't force this to happen through an act of will. I can allow it to happen. You know, I always use the obvious example that you can't grow a flower by pulling on it. You know, you only grow a flower by giving it the nutrients it needs and allowing it to grow.
And you can overwater it. You can kill it by watering it too much.
Absolutely. You have to be careful to give it the right mix of nutrients, or you can kill it that way.
Yeah, it needs time. The sun's got to come up and the sun's got to go down.
Right.
And I guess when there's a feeling of urgency, like the world's falling apart, it's hard to feel the patience or whatever that needs be.
Right. Absolutely. And yet I believe that it's important for at least some people to come to a place where no matter what happens in the world, they are still at peace, still fundamentally okay. Because I think that they have, you know, and this has been a hallmark of great realizers throughout history, is they have found a stability in something that does, you used the word earlier, that does transcend the good and the bad. That they have found, you could say, a love of life, of existence, that extends beyond their own life. It extends beyond, you know, their own group. It extends beyond the world. It's just existence with the capital E that they are standing in, and where they find solace, even in the worst of times.
Yes, I think that's something I mentioned, that I've recoiled to, you know, like the words realization and transcendence in the past, because there certainly are traditions that are about an idea of transcendence that is not one that resonates with me, like ascetic paths where you're going to remove yourself from life in order to get closer to God or something like that.
Yes.
But I think what you're talking about is what I associate with like a more tantric idea, maybe. And in that frame, transcendence can also be a certain kind of acceptance where you're okay with whatever is.
Absolutely. And can I tell you a very short story?
Please
that
do.
Illustrates that? Because, you know, it just has not been my experience that transcendence removes me from the world. And I understand that that's a problem, and it has been a problem for many people. And
that's why people go into spiritual community and get manipulated a lot of times.
Right. Exactly. I get that. And so about 10 years ago, my wife was in a bad car accident, and all I heard, the hospital called me and they said, your wife has been in a head-on collision with an 18-wheeler and you need to come to the emergency room immediately. And they wouldn't give me any more information than that. So a friend of mine drove me, because I was literally shaking like a leaf in terror. And of course, I was having visions of the worst possible case scenarios. And it was about a 20-minute drive to the hospital. And about halfway there, you know, and I had been on a serious spiritual path for about 20 years at this point. About halfway there, a voice asked me a question, or at least I perceived it that way. And it said, if the worst has happened, is life going to be bad? And I immediately thought, no, life won't be bad. My life will be bad. My life will be terrible, but life will still be as glorious as it ever was. And immediately, it didn't change how freaked out my mind was or my body was, but it allowed me to embrace this moment. And suddenly I stopped worrying about the worst case scenario. And instead, I was free to think about, how do I want to show up at the hospital in 10 minutes? Who do I want to be when I get there? And I just started to feel like I want to be available to be a positive force in whatever circumstance I find. So if that means being a support for the doctors and nurses, if that means being a support for my wife, whatever it is, I want to show up. And I really felt that it was my spiritual practice, and whatever degree of transcendence I have been able to integrate into myself, that allowed me to accept such a horrible situation in a way that didn't take me away from it. I wasn't pretending it didn't happen, but it allowed me the space to show up as fully as I could.
See, that resonates a lot with me, that idea that transcendence is about that clear perception, where you're able to recognize the moment that you're in and hold the paradox. You wrote about this paradox of like a certain amount of surrender over to like, I'm not in control over this. And at the same time, recognizing that you're co-creating the moment as well. Because you showing up that way changes that whole moment for everybody in the room, including yourself.
Absolutely. Definitely. Yeah, because I could have shown up a mess, and that would have been one contribution.
Yeah.
or I can show up kind of ready to go, ready to, what do I do? How do I help? And that creates.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.